Now, Bruce, there's nothing wrong with your ticker, mate. I've seen you vaulting over amps, leaping up onto parapets and running around the set of Iron Maiden gigs, and that's before the show's even started, mate. Be interested to know what your heart rate actually gets up to in those shows. But imagine if...
You know what, I had to go and take a test once because I do my maximum medical heart rate. Nearly killed me. Not because my heart wouldn't actually get there. It got to within one beat of what it was supposed to be at. They got me on this treadmill, like doing stuff. And they were like, oh, you've only got one more beat to go. You know, and I'm just like, I said, look, I said, can we stop? I said, because my heart is just fine. I said, but my legs are going to fall off. Trying to actually get my heart to work hard enough.
Well, I think anyone that's ever seen you on stage, you'll realise there's definitely nothing wrong with your heart. But I mean, imagine if there was.
Oh yes,
right? Imagine if there was something wrong with your heart. Imagine that you needed to go to, I don't know, hospital to have an operation to put it right. What kind of person do you think you'd want to actually have a look at that? You certainly wouldn't want a psychopath, right? Or you wouldn't think so.
I don't know. The Wizard of Oz. You see, wouldn't you want the great and powerful Oz? Because after all, that's what they were doing, wasn't it? Which was the one that wanted a heart?
That's right. But do you know what?
They're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz, and we've got him, haven't we?
We certainly have, because it's funny you should mention that, because we have got exactly that person, as you were saying. He is a diagnosed psychopath. He was one of the world's top heart surgeons. He headed up the cardiothoracic unit at John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford for many years. He was renowned for taking on operations that other surgeons around the world deemed too risky to take on. And his name is Professor Stephen Westaby. So, do you think we should have it? Should we get him on? Should we have a chat?
Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Absolutely. Steve, welcome to Psycho Schizo Espresso. Do you know what, Bruce? I've got to tell you that a few years ago, a couple of years ago, I think, I interviewed Steve at the Cheltenham Literary Festival. And he had his book out. His book had just come out, one of them, The Knife's Edge. Before that, there was Fragile Lives, of course. But Steve had just got his book out, The Knife's Edge. And I was interviewing on stage in the Cheltenham Literary Festival. There was an arena of about 400, 500 people there. I'm not quite sure how many. But anyway, literally, and Steve will remember this, literally about 5 minutes into the interview, someone, you couldn't have made it up, someone keels over in the audience. Now, I've done hundreds of gigs in my life. Steve's done a few as well, and nobody has ever keeled over. Nothing has ever gone wrong like this. Someone keels over in the middle of the interview. Now, in fact, it ended up in the papers. I think the Mail ran a feature on it, if I'm not mistaken, Steve. But of course, somebody keels over in the interview. There's gasps from the crowd. The lights go up. Steve legs it off the stage, literally almost crowd surfing into the arena, makes his way over to this chap. Don't quite know, it wasn't his tick or anything like that, but it was something, he wasn't very well. But I made a joke with him and I said, listen, mate, can you do my lottery numbers on Saturday? Because if you're going to keel over anywhere, it's in a gig where you're being, you know, I'm interviewing one of the world's top heart surgeons. And do you remember that, Steve?
I do very well.
It was hilarious. But anyway, that was a couple of years ago. Now, I'll tell you what, Steve, it's great to talk to you again, mate. It really is. And, you know, whenever you watch TV dramas like Casualty or Holby City, you tend to come away with the impression that top surgeons are flash, brash, ruthless cutting machines that kind of, you know, love a scrap with a grim reaper and don't take shit from anybody. And then, of course, when I met you, I realised this was actually true. And anyway, what I want to kick off with right away, because I know Bruce will be fascinated with this, and I am too, and of course our listeners will be, is what does it take to be a top surgeon? I mean, for high school kids out there who want to study medicine at university, medical students who are considering surgery as maybe a career. I mean, what does it take? What are the attributes of a top surgeon that are really going to help you cut it under the operating lights? What is it? What do you need?
Kevin, I can only really speak for myself, and things have changed a great deal since I started. And so you've got to take my comments with a bit of a pinch of salt, but I wasn't flash. I started out my life in the back streets of Scunthorpe, northern steel town. But I was very lucky. I was born with a strange brain. Firstly, I was ambidextrous. I had crossed cerebral hemispheres, so I used to write right-handed, but kick with my left foot and bat left-handed. And I was quite a good sportsman. So I was highly coordinated. And I reckon if you're going to be a surgeon, being highly coordinated is the first thing you need.
Right.
I was a painter. My grandfather taught me to draw and paint. He was a steel worker up there in Scunthorpe. He worked in smoke, and he smoked as everybody did in those days. And I watched him as we used to walk the dog around the slag tips. I watched him develop pains in his chest and was out with him one day when he had his first heart attack. And that brings me to the second part of what makes a surgeon. And you need motivation. I saw my grandfather have multiple heart attacks and eventually arrived home from school one day when the local GP's Black Austin Healy was parked outside. And I knew what was going on. And I looked through the curtains which were drawn. I looked through a crack and I watched my grandfather die of severe heart failure. And that's a terrible thing because he's sitting up with his hands on his knees, gasping for breath, blue because he doesn't have any oxygen, with foam pouring out his nose and mouth, which was blood-stained, and then his head went down on his shoulder and he died. So I saw heart failure very, very early on and wanted to do something about it. And it wasn't long after that I watched a program, the very first Your Life in Their Hands from America. And they were talking in 1955 about the fact that heart surgery was just beginning with something called a heart-lung machine. And at the age of 7 in the back streets of Scunthorpe, I said to myself, I'm going to be a heart surgeon. So I was motivated. I was a shy backstreet kid at the time. I didn't know then that some of my characteristics were down to a condition that would be well known later. And basically, all my life, I've had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That made me difficult, but two of the features of that problem are hyperactivity, and I was always hyperactive as a surgeon, and hyper-focus. You picture ADD kids as shuffling around and not getting very far, but if you are focused, you can get on and do it. So I was motivated, I had the hands, and I was absolutely relentless in wanting to be a heart surgeon. That's kind of a rare combination. Nobody really associates ADHD with great success.
I'm interested, Steve, in ADHD because one of my sons is, has ADHD. He's incredibly talented in many, many ways, But one of the issues we had was early on. They said, well, he actually has. If we were likening him to a computer, he's got a really massive CPU. Central processing unit is great. It's, really talented. Unfortunately, he's got no RAM. So everything, you can hyper focus, but then the follow up and the structure drops off the edge of the world. So we actually gave him a laptop from a very early age, touch typing from an early age. And we said, right, there's your RAM, there's your memory. work with that. And of course, the brain evolves as well. So he evolved into that. So now he thinks that way. But I'm intrigued as to where your ADHD was in terms of structure, how you held structure. Were you just great when it was hyper focused, when it was on the knife edge, as it were, but the mundanities were that they would
I was all over the place. I was lucky to ever get through training. I never did the paperwork. They could not extricate me from an operating theatre.
I should have been a heart surgeon.
No,
I had there was another factor actually that influenced what I did. But you're right about the focus point. Focus and dexterity made me a fast operator. And as a heart surgeon, you needed to be a fast operator because when blood hits the foreign surface of the bypass machine, it generates those changes I've told you that are very similar to COVID. So the bypass machine and long operations were killing patients. Later in America, I characterized that process. But because I was naturally fast, I got away with stuff that other people didn't get away with. But I was actually lucky to get through my training because, like people with ADD, I was difficult to handle. There was another thing that made me difficult to handle. I went from being a shy backstreet kid in Scunthorpe and a lad who sat in a lecture theatre and couldn't open his mouth to ask a question to being disinhibited and quite outrageous. And what did that for me was a head injury playing rugby. If you went to medical school in the 1960s as a male, you had to play rugby. It was as simple as that. And I'd never played before in Scunthorpe. It was always soccer up there. But I learned, and I turned out to be quite a good rugby player.
What position?
Wing forward.
Oh, this is getting really spooky now.
Destructive position. I went around attacking everybody. But I had on a cold afternoon on a pitch in Cornwall on tour, because I was creating mayhem, I ended up with a kick to the head, which rendered me instantly unconscious. And I ended up face down in a puddle. And of course, my medical student colleagues, who were very caring individuals, just kept chasing the ball and forgot about me altogether. So not only did I have traumatic unconsciousness, but I had a degree of hypoxic brain injury. And that was what I call my Phineas Gage moment. There's the famous old case in psychology where Phineas Gage was trying to build a rail track in the far west of North America, and an explosive device went off and drove a tamping iron through the front of his brain, and that cut off his it was like frontal lobotomy, and he became disinhibited and outrageous and ended up in prison. I became disinhibited but fearless as far as surgery was concerned.
Well, you were diagnosed. You were diagnosed at the time, Steve, I believe, by a clinical psychologist as being psychopathic, weren't you?
Yeah, I was hospitalised in Cornwall for 2 or 3 days. I had very swollen eyes and so on. I was transferred back to Charing Cross Hospital. And the first night I was there, I tried to seduce the nurse looking after me and was rude to the doctors, which I'd never ever been before. I was always a very, very polite lad at medical school. But they could tell that I was different. And within 3 or 4 months, I was comparing the Christmas show. I was captain of rugby very soon after that, and I just went on in a disinhibited sort of way, but I stayed fearless into my professional life. And that's what helped me take the most difficult cases from all over the place, not only in this country, but from abroad.
And I mean, there's so many odd references here that I'm thinking, oh, there we go. Oh, there's an Achilles heel there, you know, and there's an ambidextrous person. I'm thinking, tick that box, you know. So I was fascinated by the way you're so many things about your story. I'm thinking, how come I ended up as a rock star and not as at one point I wanted to be a vet. So there you go.
Well, I often think, how the hell did I end up a heart surgeon instead of a rock star?
Hey, well, you are a rock star in terms of heart surgery, aren't you?
Well, hang on a minute, because actually, Steve, I mean, it's in your book, Steve, Knife's Edge, that you were known back in the day, in less bureaucratic times, for switching on Pink Floyd in the operating theatre. You've operated in your rugby kit as well, and I think there was a story whereas other surgeons would be quaking in their boots, you were pissing in yours during operations, weren't you? But what's the Pink Floyd story? Yeah, well, Pink Floyd, rugby kit, and pissing in your boots. There you go. There's three things you can describe.
Where do we start? I'll try and do it chronologically. At the Brompton, there was very, very rarely any operating at night. The Brompton is a heart and lung hospital, no accident department. So we operated during the day and looked after the patients in the ITU at night. Just coming up to Christmas, myself and my colleagues were in the pub, as you would be in 1974. And we'd had a few pints and relatively speaking, given that I was a rugby player, I hadn't had many pints, but we got a message that an American Air Force jet was bringing in a young man after an accident in Iceland, and he'd got what we call a ruptured aorta. And the irascible German surgeon Matt Panath was on his way in to operate, and we were partying in the pub on Fulham Road. And so I thought to myself, you know, I was an ambitious young man. I wasn't inclined to be embarrassed by having to say, put my hand up and leave the operating theatre. And I'd found the great Lord Brock's operating boots in the changing room. And I used to stomp around the Brompton in Lord Brock's old operating boots. And, you know, they're the welly boots surgeons used to wear in the old days. So I thought to myself, shall I put a catheter into myself? And then say, I don't fancy shoving a pipe up my pisser. So I went up to the geriatric ward and found what you call Paul's tubing, which is rubber tubing. And I attached it to my private parts and let it down the inside of my theatre trousers into Lord Brock's left operating boot. And so we stood there doing this very tense operation. And the senior registrar, who hadn't been quite as bright about protecting himself, had to keep putting his hand up and saying, excuse me, Mr. Panath, excuse me, Mr. Panath, do you mind if I go out for a sec? And the second time he did it, Panath turned to me and said, Westaby, come up and be first assistant. Reese has been drinking, hasn't he? And I was slowly filling Lord Brock's boots and remaining comfortable and said, well, sorry, Mr. Panath, I have no idea about that. I've been studying in the library all night. So I squelched my way round to the first assistant's position and took over and maintained my dignity, and of course went on to be a great heart surgeon.
So you really were filling your boots, Steve.
Yeah, I was filling my boots.
Yeah.
But then we're in Cambridge, where my beautiful wife was the nursing sister in the accident department, and I was still playing rugby. And I was coming up to my final exams that the surgeons have to take to get their qualifications. And I was out on the rugby pitch on a cold winter's afternoon again and got a fractured jaw. So I had a couple of pints again and then went into the accident department with mud on my knees and wearing my kit, and sat there with a broken jaw and fractured through the base of a tooth, spitting out blood. while my wife was trying to get hold of the orthodontic surgeons to come in and see me. At that point, there was a very nasty accident, a motorcycle accident, right outside the front of the hospital, and they brought in a young student with a ruptured aorta, and he was bleeding out into his chest. And the chest surgeons were 15 miles away at Papworth Hospital, where all the heart and lung stuff was done. So the only person that could intervene was Westaby in his rugby kit. So I scrubbed up, put a gown on, and opened the guy's chest with blood spilling out all over me and onto the floor, and spitting my own blood into the sink. The guy didn't do well. I didn't do well. And when the orthodontic surgeon arrived, he said to Sarah, where is Westaby? And she said, he's in the emergency room with a chest open. And the orthodontic surgeon thought I'd inhaled a tooth, and it was me with my chest open. Right. So it was all a saga. But the one good thing about that day was the fracture stopped me with ADD talking my way out of a pass mark. So I passed the fellowship.
Right.
I did a lot with the great Roy Kahn, and we transplanted livers, we transplanted kidneys. He let me operate on anything that I felt confident in operating on, and me being me with ADD, I felt confident to operate on anything that moved.
Yeah.
And it was after that that I went on to heart surgery and got on with the job.
So we're hoping you are enjoying our little chat on Psycho Schizo Espresso, but don't forget, we do have a special thing for you. If you want to pay £4 a month, you can become a Patreon, which means you get the unedited content, you get the extra long episodes, and we're even going to come up with some special stuff for you. You can become a Patreon if you want at www.patreon.com/Psycho Schizo Espresso. And now back to the music.
Steve, do you think that I've been thinking about this because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think with the possible exception of neurosurgery, heart surgery's pretty much the only kind of surgery where you can immediately stave off death. Death is very, very much imminent in a lot of heart surgery. And so time is very, very much of the essence. And I guess similarly in neurosurgery, but specifically, particularly in heart surgery, cardiothoracic surgery. I'm just wondering whether, because cardiothoracic surgery is dramatic like that, do you think it attracts a certain kind of surgeon, a certain kind of personality that, you've got to be fearless?
It did in the old days. After they started publishing surgeons' death rates in cardiac surgery, it put everybody off. But in the old days, it did encourage flamboyant characters. And you mentioned music in the operating theatre. I was always very, very calm in an operating theatre. It wasn't me lying there on the table. I could afford to be calm. I needed to be calm, whatever the circumstances. I opened a lot of people in accident departments, people that have been shot through the chest, stabbed through the heart, and so on and so forth. I didn't mind where I operated. I would operate where you needed to operate. Those days have really gone. People are far, far more defensive and introspective. You mentioned that I played Pink Floyd and stuff in the operating theatre. I used to play music in theatre to keep everybody else calm.
Right.
And I tended to play the stuff that I heard when I was in America. So I used to play Foreigner. I used to play Chicago. I used to play Bruce Springsteen.
No Iron Maiden. Did you ever play any Iron Maiden?
Decapitation is not wanted.
Operating at twice the speed.
No, leave the head. Leave the head. No, don't take the head. Yeah, that's the one.
Steve, I've got to say, because Bruce, this is a question for you as well. You mentioned just a few moments ago that especially in the pioneering days of heart surgery, there was a particular kind of personality that would come to the fore. I'm going to read a quote from Knife's Edge, which is particularly striking. And you wrote, because of the huge risks involved and the pile of bodies that ensued, the pioneers all manifested a particular personality type. Bold, determined, often flamboyant, with resilience and immunity to grief. And obviously that's a very striking phrase. But Bruce, I was wondering about this. I mean, I was thinking that's very similar, I would imagine, to some of the pioneers of flight in the early days.
Absolutely.
I mean, the personality of the pioneers of flight might be quite different to like the current personality of people flying 757s. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, what you have now is a perception amongst people that, you know, that everything is so safe and nothing can possibly go wrong. It's all an autopilot, etc., etc., etc. Until something does go wrong and it's not on autopilot, and you actually have to intervene, and you just get back to the basic fundamentals. You know, what's it doing now? Are we going to be in the right place in 5 minutes' time that we want to be? If not, why not? And do something about it. Now, there's also a kind of macabre humor, not humor exactly, but a kind of macabre attitude, particularly amongst people who've been maybe in the military, when risks do get taken, sometimes wrongly, but they do. And therefore people die as a result, and often not of enemy action, but just by making mistakes, like failing to unplug an ejector seat and banging themselves out on the ground into the roof. Just things like that. I mean, I thought back to one case. So when I was doing my airline pilot academic exam, which is about a year's worth of stuff that I wished I, you know, really didn't have to do, but at the age, I did it at the age of 40, so 35, which I figured was, I was just about on the cusp of still having a brain that was capable of absorbing a lot of information in a very short period of time. Anyway, I was up in Coventry, sitting in a drafty porter cabin with these old RAF guys teaching me technical subjects about gas turbines and all the rest of it. There used to be a Algerian aircraft, 737, that would fly in and take live animals exports out to places to get slaughtered, lots of protesters and all the rest of it. But it was a regular flight coming in and out, this Air Algerian freighter, 737 freighter. And one of the ex-RAF legend ground instructors, is a guy called Sandy Thompson, was apparently one day giving one of his, you know, lectures, chalk and talk, and everybody could hear an airplane coming in because he's right by the runway. They could hear an airplane on approach, the sort of whistling noise that you get, those, you know, and of course everybody would go, oh, there's an airplane coming in a minute. And then there was just this loud bang and silence. And everybody sort of like leapt up to look at the window. Sandy never missed a beat. He went, sit down, sit down. He said, that'll be the Algerians. Altimetry, altimetry, altimetry. Anyway, next. That was it. Yeah. And he was dead right. They were knackered. They were flying in empty. They had a 15-minute flight from East Midlands. They'd set the altimeter for the wrong setting, and they flew straight into the ground. And but you know, but move on, because that was that. That's done. Next, and that was exactly.
I went out and operated in the heat and the dust of Riyadh. But I've got a reason for telling you this. As I say, I may come across as immune and to grief and so on, but I never was. But in Riyadh one day, an American cardiologist, and everybody used to go to Riyadh because the spectrum of pathology there, particularly in congenital heart disease, was huge. And he asked me to see a child that had been carried basically from Yemen. A poor woman had walked out of Yemen with a sick baby in the heat and the dust, and she'd walked across the border into Oman, and they could see the baby was desperately sick. So they sent it up to the great hospital in Riyadh, where I had the privilege to be working at the time. And this kid was only a couple of months old. The heart was in the wrong side of the chest, dextrocardia, but was obstructed by a tumour. And it was a very nasty tumour, and the kid was dying. And the American cardiologist said, I doubt there's anything you can do here, but I thought I'd show you. And I would never not try. So I said, look, I want to see if I can get this out and make it better, because the poor mother was beside herself. She'd been raped in Yemen. She'd been kidnapped from Sudan originally, and it was a terrible story. So I took the child to the operating room, and I couldn't get at the tumour because it was at the back of the heart, and the heart was on the wrong side of the chest. So I took the heart out as if I was doing a heart transplant. I removed the heart. And again, because I was a quick operator, I could take out the tumour and then stitch the heart back like a transplant. But it needed a pacemaker. And the child went back to the ITU, and I thought, that's great. I was in very self-congratulatory mood. But things didn't go well. The pacemaker failed in the middle of the night. Child had an arrest and died. And I was having breakfast the following morning, and somebody came to me and said, did you hear about last night? And I said, no, what about last night? They said, well, your baby died. And I said, oh shit, and so on. And then they said, well, worse than that. We found the mother at the bottom of the tower block. And what she'd done, she'd been given the baby to hold after death, gone to the top of the tower block in the hospital, ran off with the baby and jumped with the baby in her arms, and was found dead at the bottom of the tower block. So Westaby in Riyadh had 200% mortality for that case.
Wow.
And I only tell you this, it's in one of my books, just to say that I'm absolutely not insensitive. And I used to try so hard never to have a death in cardiac surgery, because I knew what it meant to the relatives and so on and so forth.
Just Steve, you were saying, obviously you were talking about, your fearlessness as a surgeon. And one of the things I was struck by in your book is the fact how you describe how that fearlessness in certain circumstances can actually make you more empathic towards people. And I'm thinking in particular how you would take on operations on drug addicts, on hepatitis victims, and also of people who are HIV positive, where other surgical teams, other surgeons might have been a little bit reluctant to do that.
I just operated on everybody. There was a famous case that I wrote about in The Knife's Edge, as you know, about a case in Riyadh where a child had got HIV from blood, the old contaminated blood story. And the child was in a very bad way. One of the heart valves was infected, and I operated on him, and one of the nurses pricked her finger on one of the needles and had a terrible time. She was Australian in Saudi Arabia, but had a real psychological meltdown.
Needle pricks are actually quite common. They're an occupational hazard in heart surgery, aren't they?
Oh, there was never a day. I used to do, 2 or 3 heart operations every day of the week. There was never a day that I didn't have blood under my gloves.
Yeah.
And at least once a week, I got a stick that, I could feel and was painful.
Yeah.
I jokingly used to call one of our theatre nurses stab nurse, because she handed me a blade that had already got blood on it, and it went straight through the back of my hand. So instead of staff nurse, I used to call her stab nurse. But it was common. I used to be concerned on occasions that I'd get hepatitis, but it was always me that took the hepatitis positive cases. And I didn't run away from AIDS either, because, you know, those people are unfortunate and you don't want to make them feel more unfortunate by saying, sorry, I'm not going to operate on you because you're a risk to me.
I remember you saying as well, I think it was in our interview in Cheltenham, that actually, you know, there are lots of precautions you can take, like double gloving and all that kind of stuff. But actually, sometimes the more precautions you take and the more you overthink it, the more likely it is that you're going to actually do something wrong and put yourself in danger. You've just got to kind of get on with it, haven't you? I think that's what you're saying.
That was always the case. I never double gloved because that took away the sensitivity from my fingers.
Right.
And by the way, if I put my right hand up on the screen, I did so much heart surgery and had so many instruments smacked into my hand that you can see it's still very deformed. Those fingers are extended as far as I can extend them. It's still deformed even after substantial corrective surgery. Right. And that was the reason I had to retire at 68. I could have gone on operating, but I actually had a very deformed right hand because the instruments smack into your hand.
Right.
And you rely totally on an excellent scrub nurse to do the right thing. And if by accident, and with stab nurse, it was in the middle of the night when everybody was absolutely knackered. It was absolutely not her fault. I was going to tell you another story that relates directly to my COVID experience and the fact that I became the first Westerner to learn about COVID in Wuhan in December 2019.
You were out there just as the outbreak started to become known, weren't you?
Yeah, I was asked about it. That was
Right.
That was the whole thing. The Chinese invited me to the annual meeting of the Chinese Association for Cardiothoracic Surgery, but they wanted me to open their scientific meeting with a talk about how I developed mechanical hearts, and specifically how they were now an alternative to heart transplants. The talk was on the 20th of December, and I had my little family, my grandkids and so on, coming for Christmas. So, you know, I thought I'll fly there and I'll fly back. Anyway, I gave the talk in an auditorium with 3,000 surgeons in it. And when I finished, I was mobbed by people that wanted their books signed and so on. And that included a couple of hospital administrators from the local hospital and a handful of heart surgeons. And the conference center was on the banks of the Yangtze River. Very spectacular place. Just a mile away from the famous seafood market and only a couple of miles away from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And they said to me, we've got a new virus here that we haven't yet characterized, but it's causing very severe lung injury. And we fear that we're going to lose a lot of patients with it. And they said, would you use the equipment you described on this sort of case? And I said, yeah, absolutely, I would. And I shook hands with these people from the hospital that had been looking after COVID patients. And got in a taxi and went to Wuhan airport, did my duty-free shopping for the grandkids and flew home, and not thinking anything about it until a couple of weeks' time. And then the stories started coming out. And then I saw a picture of the auditorium I'd talked in with about 400 beds that were being used for COVID patients. And of course, the rest is history. But I recognized very early on that the description of the pathology, which was first found in patients that had part of their lungs taken out for lung cancer, they found the changes of COVID in those patients. Once the patients had died from COVID, they were too scared to do autopsies. So they found the pathology by accident.
Wow. And
I said to myself, that is just the same as what the heart-lung machine was causing back in the 1960s and 70s. And I advocated very early on, just as I had in Wuhan, that what we call extracorporeal membrane oxygenation should be used to support the sickest COVID patients, not prolonged ventilation.
Well, is that extracorporeal? Is that basically a way of completely saturating the lungs with oxygen?
It's like a long-term heart-lung machine. It's simply a pump and an artificial lung.
Right.
And again, I pioneered that use of that equipment in Oxford in the early 1990s. But it was never adopted again in Britain because of the expense. It's life-saving equipment, but the maximum surge capacity in the NHS when COVID hit was 30 ECMO beds.
Right.
Now, if you look at the thousands and thousands of patients that were dying, how many of them benefited from something that could turn probably 60% of certain deaths into survival? We simply weren't equipped, but you can use ECMO for either heart failure or lung failure,
Gotcha.
or both.
Right.
Yeah. So it will replace the lungs, it will replace the heart, and you can actually keep it going for up to 3 months.
That's like a brilliant machine.
And of course,
Yeah.
when the Prime Minister was admitted to hospital with COVID, and I don't know any personal details, obviously, but he had it quite badly. He was nursed by ECMO nurses at St. Thomas's.
Right.
And the centres that do ECMO, such as St. Thomas's, the Royal Brompton, Papworth, and others, just 2 others actually, they did a really, really fine job. But what is 30 beds for the whole population?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that is an NHS issue. I love the NHS. I worked for the NHS my whole career. It is a great organisation, and the patient gets the care free at the point of delivery, which means it's equitable. But at the end of the day, in my view, any healthcare system has got to stay modern and save lives. So you shouldn't just ignore life-saving equipment if it's expensive, like with the artificial high-speed rotary blood pumps that are a direct alternative to a heart transplant. But how many implants of a left ventricular assist device are performed in this country as an alternative to a heart transplant? The answer to that is none at all, because it's not approved for that purpose.
Wow. Where are they manufactured, the actual devices themselves?
The 2 that have been in widespread use were manufactured in the US.
Right.
They were both $2 and $3 billion companies when they were bought by big corporates. One of those systems has gone down through complications. So there now only really is one frontline left ventricular assist device available to patients worldwide. There are others, but never produced in the volume that they've been needed. There's only one, and we've got one in the UK that we believe is better than the American one in use, and ours won't need an electric cable coming out of the body that impairs quality of life and gets infected.
Right. So
But can we get financial support to develop it in Britain? No. Can I just tell you, Bruce, when we went to a large company that make floor cleaning devices,
Yeah.
and that's all I'm going to say,
yeah.
to try and access better battery technology and more futuristic battery technology,
Yeah.
got no response from the company whatever.
Probably not enough money in it.
It's been a very difficult road against a skeptical healthcare system that fears it if we introduce this technology, it won't be affordable.
Right.
I was on NICE's technology committee, and I'll tell you that NICE's technology committee would not accept ventricular assist devices as an alternative to heart transplant.
Right. Yeah, it's
controversial.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, isn't it, that people that people need to go out and sometimes take some risks, and unfortunately the civil servants spend their whole lives. I mean, I have a big thing about civil servants. I'm not the world's greatest fan of them because they spend their whole life. Like, who would want to be a civil servant? I mean, why do you want to be a civil servant? Answer: job for life. And I can always just say it's somebody else's fault every 3 years, and they never have to make a call. They never have to put their life, make the first cut, you know, and actually say that's my responsibility for doing that. It's my job not to have responsibility for doing it. You know, it drives me nuts. You know,
I used to come home after a day's operating on the vast number of occasions successful. I did some fantastic operations some days, and I used to wind down by going for a run around Blenheim with my dog.
Right.
And I used to come out near the churchyard and go up into the churchyard and sit on the bench that the Polish resistance provided opposite Winston's grave.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to sit there like a barmy and talk to him, knowing that he was only about 8 foot away from me.
Right.
And as I say, the principle, never, never, never give up, was always a very good one for heart surgeons.
Yeah, there's a picture. I used to do some work for the Prince's Trust, and they used to run. They used to take over old holiday camps and put kids who are basically about to have, you know, the key thrown away. They were, you know, from housing projects or whatever, and they were deemed irredeemable, but they would take them to a camp for 2 weeks. They would give them a wage just for being there, and they would give them an education in all the practical things that nobody had ever told them, like how to cook, like how to do basic things. But they made their own entertainment. They formed bands. They did every night. They did an entertainment. They were allowed to buy beer. They were allowed to do stuff. We all ate with them and stuff like that. And I met all these kids who were talented, who were writing poetry, who were telling stories, who were, you know, I mean, I was thinking, what a waste! What an incredible waste. But in the camp shop were a series of pictures, little cartoon drawings that you could buy, and that cartoon, I don't know if you've seen it, you probably have. It's a great big bird, and the bird has got a big beak, and sticking out of the beak is a pair of legs. And then sticking out the side of the mouth of the bird is a pair of arms strangling the bird. And it says, never, ever, ever give up. And that was the best. And that was the best selling. That was the best selling cartoon. All these kids were buying that cartoon. So something's going on, you know.
I think you'll soon have had enough of me, but I would like to leave you with one of my enduring memories of my career that epitomized the never give in motto. Almost 25 years ago, I was asked by a cardiologist to see a young woman who just suffered a massive stroke. And she suffered that massive stroke at the age of 23, just 3 weeks after her wedding. And she was totally unconscious. They thought her brain was a write-off after the stroke. They were actually wrong. She had something very, very rare. She had something called locked-in syndrome. So as everybody was talking about the fact that, you know, she was a write-off, would she be an organ donor and everything else, she could hear what was going on. And eventually they started looking for why she'd had a massive stroke and did an echocardiogram of her heart. And there, inside the heart, inside the left collecting chamber, was something like a piece of seaweed, lots of fronds floating about. And that was called a left atrial myxoma, a kind of benign tumour, but with bits that break off and cause stroke. And the cardiologist said to me, is it worth operating on this young girl with a dense stroke? And I said, you can't predict what's going to happen with a stroke. I'm going to take this tumour out of her heart. And I did. Now, over the next couple of months, she came round and she described her locked-in syndrome and how awful it was, and how she'd dislocated her kneecap. It was a recurrent thing, but she'd been moved into bed and it had dislocated, and people had just put it back without any anaesthetic or anything.
Jesus.
She was manhandled. Everything that was done to her was done without any sedation. And she had all this happen to her. Now, she never recovered. She never could do anything, even speak, after that stroke. She couldn't move. But she was happy and she wanted to live. And her husband stuck with her, and she went home in a wheelchair with all the support she needed, and she lived and was happy in that state.
Yeah.
Now, the following year, she came back for a checkup and she had another tumour. And I said, I'm going to take this tumour out before you have another stroke, and it's a write-off. And I did, and she went home again. Then 9 months later, she came back and had a echo, and there were 2 more tumours. And I said, do you want me to take these out? She can't speak, but her husband said she definitely wants you to take them out. So I took them out again. So that's the 3rd large heart operation. 18 months later, she's back again with another tumour in her heart, because this is a genetically based familial multiple myxoma situation. I went a 4th time. Another 6 months, she comes back. There are 2 more tumours in different parts of her heart. And the cardiologist said, surely you're not going to operate on her again. And this was about 20 years ago now, a 5-year period of taking out the tumours. And I said, do you want me to try? And she said, not speaking, but nodding, yes, I want you to try. And I said, this has to be the last time, because I've taken out a lot of your heart and I can't take out any more. She said, yes, I want you to go ahead. So I took those tumours out. That's 20 years ago. And the cardiologist said, no more echoes because you can't operate again. 20 years later, she's still at home, happy in a wheelchair. No more strokes. The genetic storm must have abated. It must have gone away after taking out 8 tumours from her heart. So never give in did well for me, and it did well for her. And that's a message from me with my ADD. Don't give in. If ADD creates havoc with your life, just work till you make things better. And if you've got a problem like cancer or heart disease, get it fixed. You'll find a lot of people like me in the NHS that are desperate to help, and most of the time they will succeed. And I guess that's probably the time for me to think about signing off.
Well, that has been, honestly, Steve, I'm completely blown away by hearing you speak.
Me too.
That's just astonishing.
Me too. I told you it was good, didn't I, Bruce?
Yeah. No, really, really amazing.
It really was. It was fantastic. It really was, mate. Hello folks, we hope you're enjoying Psycho Schizo Espresso. Just to remind you, it's a pod production, so please feel free to like, subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your podcast. You can also reach out to us on email at pse@podprod.co.uk and follow us on social media on the hashtag Psycho Schizo Espresso. You can also of course, become a Patreon by clicking on www.patreon.com/psychoschizoespresso, where you can gain exclusive access to unedited and unfiltered content if your brain can possibly handle any more of me and Bruce.